Let me turn on recording. Okay, hello everyone. So as you can see, things are different today. Professor Parnes is traveling, so I have the honor of introducing our speaker and then mediating the questions at the end of Professor Alvarez's talk. And unfortunately, I've just discovered that my internet is unstable, so hopefully it fixes itself. But let me introduce Professor Alvarez. So we know that it is critical to study what precipitates genocide. And we in Northern California in Sonoma County are painfully aware of the dire need to study climate change. So Professor Alex Alvarez has embraced the importance of understanding how climate change can provoke genocide. So Dr. Alvarez is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. His principal interests are in the area of collective and interpersonal violence, including homicide and genocide. His subjects range from schoolyard bullies to Nazi perpetrators. And his research tells us, interestingly, that their behavioral characteristics are not that different. Dr. Alvarez was the founding director of the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values. His books include Government, Citizens, and Genocide, Genocidal Crimes, and Native America and the Question of Genocide. And his latest book is called Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide. In 2018, Dr. Alvarez was the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. Dr. Alvarez has also served as the editor for the journal Violence and Victims and founded the journal Genocide Studies and Prevention. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alvarez to our lecture series again. The lectern, so to speak, is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Let me take just a second to get this all set up here in terms of sharing my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay. All right. So hopefully you can see the screen there with the title of my presentation, Authoritarianism and Genocide in Age of Climate Change. So I'm happy to be here with you again, to have this opportunity to speak with all of you out there in the ether. Before I begin, I do want to extend my thanks again to all of my friends at Sonoma State University, the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, and the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide for inviting me back yet again. It's always a pleasure to be a part of this series. I believe this lecture series is an amazing resource for your community and your university, and I feel privileged to be a little part of it. So thank you. Now, as the introduction seems to indicate, I've spent a lot of time studying, researching, and writing about the origins and dynamics of genocide. And part of what increasingly motivates me is the struggle to make Holocaust and genocide studies relevant to the lives, concerns, and issues for all of us here in 2023 and beyond. I believe that Holocaust and genocide studies must be as forward-looking as much as it has often been past-looking. In other words, we can't continue almost exclusively to focus solely on past instances of genocide, because if we continue to do that, I think then we risk diminishing genocide studies into a particular branch of history, and we risk losing relevancy for the contemporary audience and the contemporary world. Now, this desire to write and teach about genocide in ways that help us understand the world around us today and tomorrow is something that to me seems very much important and very relevant to things going on in the world around us. So let me just take you on a quick little selective highlight of some things going on today that I think speak to its ongoing importance. If we look around the world, for example, we find that genocide is taking place currently, whether it's the genocide of the Uyghurs in China, genocide against the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar. These things are happening around us today. I was just in a webinar last week in which a number of scholars were looking at the war in the Ukraine and making the argument that because of its qualities in terms of targeting children for removal, destruction of cultural artifacts and locations, targeting of civilians and so forth, that it is essentially an example of genocide that is taking place before our very eyes. If we look at the DRC, we find that there is escalating violence in a part of Africa that since the mid-1990s has seen many millions of people killed, traumatized, displaced, and so forth. And all indications suggest that the situation there has been deteriorating yet again. We have currently a human rights crisis unfolding in Nagorno-Karabakh, with the blockade of the Lashin corridor and the deprivation of basic human needs, food, medical supplies, and other kind of things as a consequence of that blockade. In the Horn of Africa, we have a situation that currently has settled down from the violence that had been going on there for quite a period of time, but which is currently at risk of widespread famine and the resulting civil and political unrest in a region that historically has been marked by all kinds of civil war and insurgencies. In Iran, even though it's not front page on the news as it had been for a while, social unrests, protests, and violent crackdown and executions on the part of the government continue unabated. Now, there are a lot of other examples that I could mention, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are many conflicts, potential or incipient conflicts, social and political instability, all of which, to my way of thinking, illustrate the relevance of genocide and related kinds of violence to the present day. Now, in recent years, as my brief biography indicated, my own work has focused in large part on a particular issue, which is namely exploring the ways in which climate change heightens the risk for the development of violent conflict, including war and genocide. And even though climate change is by now a largely accepted reality, most attention continues to focus on what this means for the natural world around us. But I want to remind us that we do not exist independent of the natural world, even though we often act as if we are somehow separate from the natural world, but rather we are an integral part of the global ecosystem. This is as true today as it was from the very beginning of humanity's time on Earth. Human beings, both individually, collectively, have always had to adjust to the vagaries and vicissitudes of the climate and environmental conditions and changes in the world around them. In other words, civilizations have risen and fallen as a consequence of climate change. And as technologically sophisticated as we now are here in the US, for example, this fundamental reality has not changed. So in a nutshell, my argument is that climate change impacts will challenge the ability of nations and communities to cope, ameliorate, and adapt to the altered conditions. Think about what we are seeing around the world. The once predictable weather patterns that are increasingly unstable, unpredictable, and more extreme. Think of the weather-related disasters that are increasingly common, not only around the world, but in your backyard. It used to be when I gave these presentations, I was just talking earlier, just before we began with Stephen about this, when I first began talking about these issues at Sonoma way back when in, I think around 2015 or so, it was much more in the abstract. And I would spend time, and over the years, I've often spent time trying to bring to the viewers' attentions or the audience's attention local kind of variations, local changes, local things going on that help make the case that we are seeing once stable kinds of weather patterns change in front of our very eyes. I don't feel the need to do that anymore. I think all we have to do is turn on the news or look out of our doors to see whether in California, where you are, or Arizona, where I am, some of these things unfolding in front of our very eyes. Think about the whiplash that you are experiencing in California, going from extreme drought to all of these atmospheric rivers dumping unprecedented amounts of precipitation in your communities, in the mountains of California, and so forth. And while no storm, no fire, no heat wave is necessarily indicative of climate change by itself, when we put it all together, however, it tells the story of a world that is heating up very quickly. Now, for centuries, humanity has benefited from remarkably stable, predictable weather patterns with some periodic fluctuations. But this predictability is an essential commodity for agriculture, to know when to plant, to know when to reap, for livestock, for industry, for communal life. And what we're experiencing, what we're beginning to experience, is that as these weather patterns become more erratic, it's simply unavoidable that these effects will ripple out to impact and disrupt many sectors of society. All of these changes we can view as stressors, as things that we have to deal with, adapt to, ameliorate, and so forth. These stressors, coming as they will, as they are coming in succession, often amplifying each other, threaten to overwhelm the ability of communities and governments to cope and adapt. Now, in 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence distributed the first ever national intelligence estimate on climate change that warns of global instability and heightened tensions and conflict between nations as the consequences of a warming world. Representing the first ever collective assessment of all 18 US intelligence agencies about the risks that these changes hold for national security, the report not only identifies nations and regions that are particularly vulnerable to instability and conflict, but also points out certain kinds of consequences, such as the production of large numbers of refugees and displaced populations that are vulnerable to exploitation and persecution, which can destabilize surrounding regions and create massive humanitarian disasters. This is an issue I'll be returning to in a little bit. Another US government report around that same time detailed the financial and human costs of climate change for the US and concluded that climate change will cost hundreds of billions of dollars annually and will result in thousands of additional deaths every year from both the direct and indirect consequences of a warmer world. Of key importance in this report were the often interconnected ways in which climate change will negatively impact infrastructure and transportation, energy demand and production, domestic and international trade, agriculture, fishing, tourism, water availability, healthcare, and many other sectors of society. These kinds of consequences are not limited to the US, but they are really global in their impact. There's no region, no nation in the world that will not be impacted. And these shocks will challenge the ability of nations and communities to cope and deal with these changes. And they're going to cost a lot, not just economically, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of human suffering. They also increase the risk for violent conflict, including war, including genocide. We have to understand that collective violence doesn't just happen or erupt out of nowhere. Instead, as all of the research on genocide and related mass atrocity crimes reveals, there are specific situations, specific triggers that help bring about violent reactions and solutions. And we know that as nations struggle to adapt and build resilience, over time, that ability may well be eroded. As they struggle to meet the needs of its people, many communities, many societies will experience a lot of difficulty in trying to deal with safety and security. And the kind of anxiety brought about by these kind of things can easily heighten tensions between different groups, especially if there are pre-existing fault lines, right? Things that separate people around whether it's race or ethnicity or religion or something along those lines. And if a government is seen as failing to meet the needs of its population, social, economic, and political instability increase. We know this. These kind of situations have historically often served to deepen divides and fuel extremism. Now, we have to recognize that some locations are more vulnerable to these kind of developments than others. So if we look, for example, we find North Africa, as an example, is at high risk because of low resiliency and adaptive capacity. The reasons for that are things like environmental fragility, desertification, drought, and endemic poverty. More specifically in that region, a very recent report has found that Lake Chad has shrunk 90% in the last 60 years because of drought, irrigation, building of dams, and population increases, which results in more demands on the water supply. Now, this 90% loss is helping to fuel violent conflict and migration. Fishermen, herdsmen, farmers, and others who depend on the waters of the Lake Chad Basin are increasingly struggling and fighting with each other in an effort to survive and protect their ways of life. What does it mean to be a fisherman and need to take an AK-47 to work with you when you go to do your work? The report also found that decreased water, a vital resource, has actually fueled violent extremism. Think of groups like Boko Haram, for example, and has actually served to displace 3 million people and an additional 11 million who are in need of humanitarian assistance. In Tunisia, President Said has been purging political opponents, politicians, journalists, activists, judges, and others as he converts his country to more authoritarian rule. He has been specifically targeting immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa and suggesting that they are bringing crime and violence and are trying to change the demographic contours of the country. In case this sounds familiar to you, it should. It is a Tunisian version of Great Replacement Theory, which is a white supremacist belief we've been hearing a lot about in recent years in places such as the US. Many of the perpetrators of mass shooting events in the United States in recent years, think of the grocery store in Buffalo, New York, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, think about the Chabad in Poway, California, the El Paso Walmart as examples. All of the shooters in these events were believers in Great Replacement Theory. West Africa is also considered to be at high risk with low resiliency and adaptive capacity because of endemic political corruption and a history of pervasive ethnic conflict. And what we're seeing in Nigeria currently, for example, just as one indication, is an increase in violent conflict between herders and farmers as resources, especially water, become scarce. It is violence that is also often amplified by tribal and ethnic differences. Let us not forget that the 21st century's first genocide in the Darfur region of the Sudan had many of the same kinds of origins and dynamics. Similarly, the Indian subcontinent is also perceived to be at high risk for conflict and violence for the reasons you see on the slide. And we can see some of these issues at play in the increasingly heated conflict around border issues in the Kashmir region that has recently erupted, I think it was last year, in fact, into violent border clashes. In many ways, to simplify what can be seen as a very complicated issue, a lot of it is about access to water, which Kashmir is rich in, but which all three nations want access to for their industrial, agricultural, and community needs. This is scary since all three are nuclear powers, and both Pakistan and India have fought a number of wars in the past. We also know that India has become more authoritarian in recent years, and its politics are increasingly ethno-nationalist in orientation. Now, Europe and North America, on the other hand, are considered relatively low risk. And much of this is because of wealth that makes adaptation possible. There are other factors as well, but in the interest of time and making sure I have enough time to have some discussion, questions, those kind of things, I'm just going to keep moving forward if that's all right. But essentially, it costs money to build new or retrofit existing infrastructure, to build, to rebuild, to get supplies, to get resources to those impacted by disasters and changing environmental conditions, and to relocate populations after disasters. But even among the developed and wealthy nations, the situation varies tremendously, and no one is immune to the consequences of climate change and its risks. And let me briefly, kind of in that vein, speak a little more about some of those various risks, because we can look at Eastern Europe, for example, where just over a year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine and began a war that has just entered its second year, and which is marked by not only war crimes and massive human rights violations, but which, as I indicated earlier, is also potentially genocidal in nature, given the attempts to destroy national identity in Ukraine, the destruction of symbols of Ukrainian nationhood, and the removal of Ukrainian children as examples. Russia's actually been active in Ukraine since 2014 with its support for separatists in several eastern provinces, as well as the annexation of Crimea. While this war is not directly an example of climate-induced or facilitated conflict, it does illustrate some really important points. One, while it is portrayed by President Putin and his supporters as a defensive war against Ukrainian Nazism, the influence of the United States in the West, we should not neglect the fact that the eastern portion of Ukraine is incredibly resource rich with mines and industry. In fact, eastern Ukraine has Europe's largest deposit of rare earth minerals used in various technologies. We also know that this one conflict has had worldwide impacts, not only in terms of geopolitics, but direct impacts in terms of the ability to sustain life. In the Horn of Africa, for example, they've been facing drought for 40 years, a situation compounded by endemic insurgency and civil war. And in that region, they depend heavily on Ukrainian wheat to help feed their population. Because of the war, much of that supply has been cut off, and they are currently dealing with widespread food insecurity that is teetering into outright famine. Now, to continue moving forward, in my opinion, two of the most dangerous issues, two of the most dangerous facilitators, in other words, things that help make conflict and violence more likely, that make it easier, and so forth, concern resources and population displacement. Scarce or diminishing resources such as fresh potable water will heighten competition and tension between communities and nations as they struggle to protect, control, or acquire water and other resources they need to survive and thrive. Now, since we're all living in the American Southwest, I'm guessing most of you are from the Southwest. I live in Arizona. We know the conflict around Colorado River water supplies and the ways in which the different states of the Colorado Basin, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, and California, have been fighting over access to that water. Now, fighting legally, right? But what happens in situations where those water supplies cross international borders? Will it always be legal or other kinds of nonviolent conflict? We know that around the world, water has been historically a flashpoint for violent conflict and strained relations between, as I indicated, India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Increasingly, I've seen in media outlets from reporters who report on some of these kind of conflicts, there is increasing talk about water wars and these kind of things as an indication of the high stakes and the high tensions as communities struggle for access to or protection of water resources. We also shouldn't be surprised to learn that it's already been linked to war and genocide in places such as the Darfur region of the Sudan and Syria, for example, where droughts contributed to certain kinds of social and political instability and unrest, and played a contributing role in the development of civil war and genocide. Now, according to the United Nations, close to 1 billion people around the world do not have access to supplies of clean water. Another 2.5 billion do not have sufficient sanitation for sewage and waste disposal, which is a condition that lends itself to the development of and transmission of disease. The World Health Organization suggests that almost 2 billion people use water sources contaminated by feces, which transmit things such as dysentery, cholera, typhus, and polio. And these diseases are estimated to kill around 500,000 people every year. Some folks have even suggested that diarrhea kills 1 child every 18 seconds, 200 children an hour, and almost 5,000 children every single day. And in fact, the lack of adequate or clean water is the leading cause of death in the entire world, especially among children. Furthermore, the World Health Organization predicts that by 2025, half of the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas. And this problem is only expected to worsen because of population growth, urbanization, and rising standards of living in many parts of the world, all of which contribute to increased demands for water. Whether it's nicer homes, more clothes, cars, other conveniences of modern life, better food, more varied food, simply more food, the reality is that the higher the standard of living people enjoy, the more they demand, and that requires water. We often don't realize that producing consumer goods and food requires a great deal of water during the refining, production, and manufacturing processes, not to mention the water used to irrigate crops. In fact, the principal culprits in our increasing demand for water are agriculture and industry. Agriculture alone takes up to 70% of available freshwater supplies. Industry requires another 20%. According to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, it's water, not land, that limits the amount of agricultural production, that limits food, in other words. All right. Now, another important issue that I believe is likely to foster violent conflict concerns population displacement, arguably one of the most direct, significant impacts for humanity. Currently, the world is experiencing record-breaking numbers of people displaced by environmental degradation, disasters, and conflicts. As you can see from this chart, in 2022, the numbers exceeded 100 million for the first time, something that represents 1 out of every 78 people in the world. But these numbers, as dramatic as they might seem, and I hope they do hit you as being really important, because these are huge numbers, and especially when we recognize that all of these represents other human beings who are forced out of their homes and their communities, I think we can get starting to get a sense of the magnitude of this crisis. Population projections suggest a massive increase in the number of climate refugees in the coming decades as people are forced out of their homes and communities by the direct, think storms, flooding, and indirect, think civil war, revolution, and so forth, consequences of climate change. History very clearly teaches us that large-scale population movements have often destabilized nations and entire regions, and the numbers projected for the coming years dwarf previous episodes of population displacement. Now, not only can such large influxes disrupt a society, but it can also lead to violent persecution and scapegoating against those displaced who may not be welcomed in the communities and regions to which they flee in search of safety and security. These vulnerable groups have all too often been labeled, dehumanized, and attacked. And climate maps reveal that all nations will experience significant population shifts. And you should know that population displacement is not just something that will occur in faraway places. And I've thrown in a few slides to give you a feel that even here in the United States, we are going to see large shifts in populations. In the US, agriculture and temperate climate zones are projected to shift dramatically northward, while long-term drought, sea level rise, and flooding and dangerous humidity levels actually will make large swaths of the southern regions of the country much less habitable. Research suggests that 162 million Americans, almost 1 in 2, will experience a decline in the quality of their environment, such as more heat, less water. That might be a factor in decisions made to move. For about 93 million, those changes will be severe. 1 in 12 Americans are projected from the southern half of the US to move toward California and the American West and Pacific Northwest because of climate influences alone. And this is projected to lead to increased poverty, more income inequality, rapid and chaotic urban growth, increased crime. The criminological literature on that is very clear, and potentially tensions within and between communities and populations. It also means that more Americans are going to be likely to face the kind of mega fires that some of you have experienced there in California. These mega fires are projected to become more likely. Northern cities will get much hotter. In a few decades, Portland, Oregon may feel like Tempe, Arizona does today. Extreme humidity from New Orleans to northern Wisconsin will make summers increasingly difficult and turn otherwise seemingly survivable heat waves into health threats. And by 2040, extreme water shortages will be very common west of the Missouri. Even states like Georgia, Florida, Alabama will face regular droughts. Many aquifers are being depleted faster than they're being replenished. We know crop yields will be decimated from Texas to Alabama and all the way north through Oklahoma and Kansas and into Nebraska. And we also know that millions of Americans, by some estimates, 13 million, will be moving away from increasingly flooded coastlines. Now, I throw some of this in there, not just to freak you out or anything like that, but just to reveal that these issues we're talking about here are not just ones for faraway kind of places in the developing world or the global south, but are ones that are close to home as well. What's happening is that the human climate niche is shrinking dramatically, and a lot more people around the world are going to be on the move, looking for security, safety, opportunity in the coming years and decades. And all of these changes, all of these challenges will strain the ability of governments to meet the needs of citizens. It runs the risk of heightening tensions among and between communities, populations, and nations, and means that there are certain groups that will be more vulnerable to othering, to scapegoating, because they're defined as different, as dangerous, or simply as being superfluous. Now, I think it's also important to understand the political context within which these climate-induced challenges must be met. And even here, the news on that front is troubling. The evidence tells us that we are living in an era in which democracy is on the retreat, and authoritarianism, ethno-nationalism, and populism are on the rise. What we know is that authoritarian regimes are often built on notions of an exclusionary, in other words, on a narrow national identity, and the belief that immigrants represent a threat. Authoritarian nations also have fewer constraints on their ability to control the instruments of power, media and industry, and the justice system. What that means is persecution, mobilizing antagonism against outsiders or groups defined as an internal or an external enemy, and similar kinds of policies and processes become that much easier. There are fewer, to borrow language from here, there are fewer checks and balances preventing these kind of extremes. We also know that authoritarian states also tend to be more extreme and radical in their approaches to problems, and are particularly dangerous when the national community is defined narrowly. What's really very disturbing and troubling for many who look at these issues is that even long established and ostensibly strong democracies have not been immune to this trend. We have seen in many long-standing democracies a dramatic rise in popular support for far-right political parties, most of which I would suggest espouse extreme nativist, xenophobic, and even nationalist agendas. And even here in the United States, we have not been immune to these challenges to our democratic institutions and processes. And in fact, in recent years, the US has experienced substantial autocratization in which democratic attributes have been diminished or lost. And in fact, last year, the US was listed as a backsliding democracy for the first time. Further research indicates that in the US and in Western Europe, popular support for democratic principles and practices have diminished, while support for non-democratic modes of government have increased. Growing numbers of Western Europeans and Americans, in other words, are critical of the messy, difficult, infuriating process of liberal democracy as a form of government, and increasingly supportive of more authoritarian rule with its promise of easy solutions and quick fixes to problems that plague different nations around the world. Well, we also know that these kinds of populist sentiments, the support for more authoritarian rule, often appear to be directly related to increased rates of violence directed at those groups seen as being others or outsiders. And as a result, what we've seen here in the US, what we have seen in other countries, is a dramatic resurgence in hate crimes, anti-immigrant rhetoric and violence, and other forms of intolerance, prejudice, and violent conflict, which are at record levels in a number of countries around the world, including the United States. So let's put some of these things together, this trend towards authoritarianism, with the issue of population displacement. We know that the numbers, the hundreds of millions of people that are projected to be on the move around the world, will be coming into regions and countries in which they are not necessarily going to be welcomed with open arms, but rather seen as a threat, as a drain, as a challenge. As nations struggle with resource loss, environmental deprivation or degradation, population dislocation, and various other kind of climate-induced or climate-facilitated challenges, we can see how refugees, migrants, and displaced populations may not be warmly received. And in fact, we also have to understand that in many ways, they are particularly vulnerable groups. We know that even though we believe we have this tradition that your rights are invested in your status as a human being, the actual practice of human rights oftentimes are dependent upon your state, your government, creating mechanisms, laws, customs, traditions, and so forth that protect those. And when people are forced out, when they are stateless, they don't have those same kind of protections. They also lack power, the power of community, the power of networks, the power of resources, and so forth. Displaced populations are incredibly atomized and vulnerable populations. The risks are also especially heightened, if you will, in places where there is a pre-existing history of intolerance, racism, persecution, these kind of things. When confronted with diminishing resources, social instability, and rising numbers of refugee populations, popular fear and prejudice can easily germinate into more active kinds of persecution, violent conflict, and in the most extreme examples, programs of expulsion and extermination. History teaches us that there are always those political, social, religious, or other kind of leaders who are willing to exploit and use such sentiments in order to scapegoat minorities, retain or gain power, to implement their own repressive policies and agendas, especially against vulnerable and unpopular groups. Keep in mind, the genocides of tomorrow will not necessarily look like the genocides of today. And so let me highlight what I mean by this. In 2005, for example, Eric Reeves, a scholar of the genocide in Darfur, began arguing that the genocide there had morphed over time, and it became more about engineered disease and malnutrition than violent killing. With the vast numbers of displaced people around the world that will be seen as a drain on resources and as being a superfluous population, will we increasingly see forms of genocide that don't necessarily fit the template of what we're used to from the past? Think about the industrialized killing of the Holocaust or things along those lines. But will we see genocide as a kind of active neglect, right? Will we see genocide through the denial of resources rather than direct violent killing? Alex de Waal has shown how famine has sometimes been used as a weapon in the past. Think of the forced famine in the Ukraine, the Holodomor. In the past, mass starvation has not occurred because of a lack of food and overpopulation, but because of political decisions and failings. Famine has been used as a weapon. Now, what de Waal highlights is that actually famines were largely wiped out with the spread of democracy, the development and application of human rights, and a decline in warfare. But what happens in a world in which these developments, because of the consequences and the strain around climate change issues, but what happens when these developments are halted or reversed? What happens to all those people, those vulnerable populations who are perceived as not belonging, as taking resources, people who are different, who may be labeled as criminals, rapists, and other kinds of pejorative imagery? Will we target them in places through intentional neglect and denial of access to vital resources such as food, water, and shelter? Those of you who are familiar with the euthanasia program that the Nazis began in the 1930s, the T4 euthanasia program, that the language that was often used when the state began targeting those with physical or mental disabilities and challenges, the language that they often used and the mindset was one that had been developed through the hard times of the First World War, the blockade, the malnutrition, the lack of food supplies, and so forth. But it was a mindset in which these people were labeled as not only life unworthy of life, lebensunwert Lebens, but also as useless eaters. Will we see that kind of mentality revived again as communities struggle to feed, to supply their own populations, and seeing the influx of newcomers, people who are displaced from their own communities? For all of these kinds of reasons, an increasingly authoritarian world poses some very real dangers for persecution, xenophobia, and many forms of violence, including genocidal violence. Now, I know at this part, some of you are going, this guy's a real downer. I get it. This presentation has largely provided a grim and depressing list of possibilities, maybe even in some cases probabilities. Andrew Harper, the UNHCR Special Advisor on Climate Action, has suggested that climate change is the defining crisis of our time, and I could not agree more. Yet, and this might surprise you, despite the litany of doom and gloom, this laundry list of horrific potentials, I'm still hopeful. As challenging as things are, and as formidable as the difficulties that lie ahead, there are still reasons for encouragement and hope. We always have to remember that violence is contingent. It's not inevitable. It's not unavoidable. Violence is the result of certain kinds of choices and decisions that are made. And because of that contingency, it is avoidable. Slowly but surely, it seems as if the world is finally waking up to the reality of the forces that we have unleashed. Industries, interest groups, and economic sectors once resistant and even hostile to combating climate change initiatives are increasingly getting on board with such kind of things. To me, as someone who's been doing this for about 10 years or more, actually, it's only been in the last few years that it feels like I'm not as lone a voice as I once felt. That more and more climate change is on people's minds and is reflected in people's actions and policies, people who are working hard to make a difference. It feels like, and I hate to use this well overused word, but we have reached an inflection point. And for the first time, it feels as if the issue of climate change has reached a critical threshold of awareness and attention required for the adoption of more comprehensive and unified strategies to address these critical issues. And what's really encouraging for me is that much of these changes, much of this charge is being led by young people such as yourself. We are not necessarily doomed to a violent and apocalyptic future in which we allow our fears and our struggles to overwhelm our ability to work together for the common good. And if there's anything that the pandemic that we are emerging out of has taught us, is that while some people succumb to the conspiracy theories, to the fears and anxieties, what we actually see is that in communities all around the world, people came together to help, to work together, to cope and adapt. It shows in some ways the best that we can be, right? The ways in which vital service workers, doctors and nurses and others work to maintain the functionings of civil society. This is something to hang on to. Given the right leadership, the right popular support, we've always been capable of amazing accomplishments. That is a quality of our species, our adaptability, our resilience. And it is my real hope that future generations may look back at this time and see humanity came together and rose to the challenges presented by climate change and avoided some of the worst outcomes, the worst possible scenarios, some of which I shared with you today. And so with that, let me stop screen share and turn it back over for any kind of questions and answers, those kind of things. If I can figure this out. Okay. Stop share. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so just a reminder to everybody, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box and I will moderate the questions for Dr. Alvarez. So first question, have climate issues fed into Russia's decision to invade Ukraine?
So, I debated bringing that issue up, but it's such in the news, the focus, so much attention that, and it reveals, as I try to indicate, so many of the things that I'm talking about. Um, I don't think that climate change issues directly fed into it, even as an underlying important facilitator. But it reveals again that with violence and these solutions, it's never one thing. I've studied not only collective violence, but individual forms of violence. And there oftentimes are many layers to the onion, right? There's a lot to it. And with the thinking of the Russian leaders, a lot has to do with geopolitics, history, and national identity, the idea of spheres of influence and buffers, all this other kind of thing. But I cannot get away from the reality that the Ukraine is an incredibly productive land whose resources are valuable. And it is something that Russia is in desperate need of. Now, that need for resources will only increase over time as the impacts of climate change are increasingly felt. But we also see in that in this war, all of the global implications of conflict, of the destruction that are caused by these kind of issues. What happens in many parts of the world when governments are unable to meet the needs of their population, and in that power vacuum, other forces arise, whether invasions from other countries, wanting to procure resources, whether insurgencies, revolutionary movements, terrorism, warlords, and so forth, and those countries descend into violence. Think about the DRC in the wake of the Rwandan genocide that destabilized it and led to violence lasting for many, many years, and which killed well over 5 million people. These things have a ripple effect beyond particular borders and regions. The biggest displacer in the world historically has been conflict. So I realize it's kind of a long-winded roundabout way of getting at your question. So my answer in part is that no, I don't think that climate changes specifically were underlying those issues, but related issues were, such as resources and those kind of things. Thank you for that. Great question.
Okay, so another question comes from one of our board members, Yeho. With as much documentation of the ominous conditions as you clearly presented, my question is, are most leaders burying their heads in the dusty lands, or are there initiatives towards stabilization of these conditions? How successful are they? I think this gets to whether we have a virtuous cycle or an unvirtuous cycle.
Yeah, another great question. It's hard to generalize to all political leaders and so forth. I think in the past, there was a unwillingness to address it. I think in many ways, there are a lot of things that fed into that. For some, they didn't see it as an issue, right? This idea that, yeah, no big deal, it gets a little warmer, we're fine. For many others, they want to protect the status quo economically, right? Politically, socially, and so forth. For others, I think there's been foot dragging because there is oftentimes a hesitation or unwillingness to move too quickly because of the shocks that it creates in the system, right? So people are trying to buy time in order to transition over the economic systems to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources and so forth. So I think a lot of things have been going on. I think in many ways, what we have seen has been some rhetoric, some very well reported on kind of conventions and meetings, right? Think of the UN-sponsored global conventions, think of the Paris Accords and so forth, that in many ways were largely symbolic in terms of what's actually being done. But honestly, so let me say this, up to now, very little's been done, especially not collectively, especially not at a global level, which is where it has to happen. But it feels to me for the first time that's changing. I think we are really waking up. And I think what's happening is that a lot of governments are not only seeing these things unfolding in real time around them, these disasters that they've got to deal with, but they're also facing increased pressure from young people around the world. When Greta Thunberg, I'm guessing all of you are probably familiar with her, when she began doing work in this area, there's this great picture of her in front of the Swedish Parliament building holding a sign, and she's all by herself and no one's paying attention to her. And now she is perhaps one of the most powerful voices for action on climate change. That shows you even what individual voices, right? What can be accomplished with enough of belief, passion, and hard work. And it feels like we're getting there. The question is, will we get there fast enough, right? The window in which we can limit these changes to manageable levels we can adapt to, that time frame is shrinking.
Okay, so another question from a student in the course. Looking at the population displacement graph, I'm shocked by the sudden rise in the amount of displaced people starting around 2012. Do you know what explains this?
Great question. No one thing, right? There are many things behind it. When we look at displacement, population displacement, and we use certain terms that I think are convenient terms, but sometimes miss some of the myriad kinds of reasons. We talk about migrants versus refugees, right? Some voluntary, some involuntary, these kind of things. We miss some of the complexities here. But in regards to the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, their data, their tracking on these kind of issues, the work that's done by various NGOs on these kind of issues, what we find the single biggest contributor to these kind of things are conflicts. The places where people are coming from are places that are war zones. So think of Syria, think of South Sudan, think of Afghanistan, places where people are in fear for not just their physical safety, but their futures, right? Their ability to meet the needs of keeping themselves and their families alive. These are desperate people. I mean, why else would you risk all of your loved ones in incredibly hazardous journeys? We also know another important variable that is increasingly part of the equation is that people are living in communities, in regions, in countries where they're unable to survive anymore, where extreme water drought is destroying agriculture, for example. People are no longer able to work their farms. Livestock are dead, crops are decimated, and they are leaving because they have no choice. Oftentimes, these people stay within the borders of their countries. They move from rural parts of the country to big cities. And essentially what's going on is they are trading rural poverty for urban poverty, right? But also increasingly, they're going further and further afield. They're going to other parts of the world in search of these kind of opportunities. And that trend is only going to increase because we are seeing extreme environmental degradation. We're seeing loss of arable land. I mean, think about the Pacific Island nations, the ones that are now actually planning for a future where their countries physically will not exist anymore because they'll be underwater. So to answer that question, the increase in population displacement has to do with ongoing conflicts and increased levels of environmental degradation, and the resulting civil and social and political unrest that has manifested then in these record numbers of people on the move. And what's again important to remember when we look at these numbers, they're just numbers, but really we are talking about, men, women, children, from all walks of life, from countries around the world who are desperate.
Okay, so we saw the course that the Hitler regime took once it ascended to power: military force and conquest, colonizing the East. Do you see any hope that alternatives will be considered and pursued in place of again and again wars?
Well, that's the real question, Todd. Thank you. Great question. In many ways, the Second World War, especially the move eastward, right? This quest for Lebensraum has been characterized by some as one of the biggest land grabs, right? It was envisioned as a genocidal war from the beginning. It was about resources, land, all of that kind of thing. Will we see that kind of thing occur in the future? In worst case scenarios, absolutely. I think, that there will be strong temptations from countries to exploit vulnerable neighbors as they seek to acquire their resources. When we think about, for example, what occurred when Zaire collapsed, Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? You have a failed state descending into anarchic violence and civil war. You had a lot of the surrounding countries actually move in with peacekeeping forces along with the United Nations and so forth. But what was very interesting is that over time, many of those nations moved from protecting civilian populations, trying to keep combatants apart, to actually using their forces to protect the harvesting of resources from one of the most resource-rich regions of the world. And there is a fear that we will see that kind of violence again, right? The world was shocked when Russia invaded the Ukraine, an international war. After the end of the Second World War, that kind of conflict pretty much died out. Mostly what we see, the most common kind of wars in the present era have been civil wars. There are risks, yeah. Now, what we have seen in regards to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is that there has been a fairly concerted international coalition or movement to try to censor and to sanction Russia. But at the same time, we realize there are countries for various kinds of economic reasons and so forth that continue to want to do business with Russia because they can benefit from it and because their people will have the fuel or those kind of things. So, Todd, I don't know that I can answer the question. My hope is there will be alternatives, right? A lot of people who are working in regards to politics and international affairs, genocide prevention, and so forth, are working to come up with mechanisms that will disincentivize and that will deter such kind of blatant moves. Whether or not that is successful, I don't know.
So not to condone the fighting, but are the territories in Ukraine where the Russians are fighting indigenous ancestral territories like Artsakh is to the Armenians? Also, thank you for mentioning the Lachin corridor blockade in Artsakh, since this suffering is not top news.
Right. It is an unfortunate reality of our world that there are things that are going on, so many, that there are these human rights catastrophes unfolding as we speak, and we are largely oblivious to it, or something else catches our attention and puts some, things that are continuing on the back burner. And I think that is one of those issues. What we know about Russia's claim to Ukraine, and a lot has to do with the fact that in the eastern part of the Ukraine, much of the population is Russian speaking, have strong connections with Russia. The boundaries, the historical borders have shifted. We know this history, right, about empires and these borders that have changed. This is why Timothy Snyder wrote about the bloodlands and all of, this complicated history in the East. And so what I worry about as some of these resource issues, for example, or population issues increasingly come to the fore, that some of those historic claims to territory, to a population, right, an ethnic population, an indigenous population, a particular ethnic group or so forth that lays claim to another nation or so forth, that these kinds of variables will become the overt justification and pretexts for underneath what are essentially attempts to acquire resources that are necessary to maintain a certain kind of society, whether it's industrial, technological, or whether it's about simple, fundamentals like potable water, that kind of thing.
So I can also speak to that. So I think, as most people here know, I'm a historian of the Soviet Union, and the fundamental problem in Ukraine is that Ukraine and Russia, and actually Belarus as well, share a common point of origin, which is the medieval state of Kievan Rus. The word Rus, from which we get Russian, actually comes from the Scandinavians. And so Russians referred kind of casually to Kiev as being the Mat Ruskih Gorodov, the mother of Russian cities. Well, it's also the mother of Ukrainian cities, and it's the mother of Belarusian cities. So that kind of one medieval entity has three trajectories. I think the Russian claim is probably strongest on Crimea. Crimea wasn't included in Ukraine until 1954. And I think even the Crimean nationalists, they don't really kind of aspire, or they don't really couch Crimea as being an essential part of Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that Crimea should have been seized in the way that it was. And then the territories in the east, those are, I would argue that they're much more Soviet than they are Russian, because people came from all over the Soviet Union to work in the coal mines and the steel factories. There was even a sizable Greek-speaking population in Donetsk Oblast. Yeah, I guess I'm reluctant to, historians often remark that the first lie that nationalists tell is about the origins of their nation. And so I'm reluctant to endorse the idea that there's an ancestral claim that Russians have on Ukraine. Okay.
But if I might, let me just fit.
Yeah.
But that doesn't deter leaders who see utility in using those kinds of claims or ideas in helping provide some legitimacy to these attempts to acquire land, territory, and the resources that come with it.
Oh, for sure. Which is why what we do here is so important.
Right.
Okay, another question. One sees many failures in the remembrance of the Shoah in the post-war period. Germany was rehabilitated, yet the catastrophic toll that Germans inflicted on East Europe remained to this day. Do you see any possible hope for, I think it might be for our post-war condition, or maybe perhaps a way out of the post-war condition?
I guess I'm not sure, Todd, exactly what you're getting at with that question. I'm not, Stephen, any help?
Yeah, I don't know quite what Todd meant there. So,
I mean, what I will say, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, is that we often think of the Holocaust and the war ending, right, boom, and peace reigned once again, and then you have the quest for justice and all this other kind of thing. But the reality is that this incredibly destructive conflict did not end the violence with the end of official hostilities, that there was massive amounts of population displacement, of peoples moving throughout not only Eastern Europe, but in the Balkans and other parts of Europe as well. And that there were bouts of ethnic cleansing in the post-war years. There were civil wars that were fought. The thing that we have to remember is that these conflicts, even though we often talk about them as if they're very discrete and easily encompassed, they have repercussions and ramifications that spread out geographically and also through time, right? And that we are still dealing with, in many ways, that post-war order and the consequences of things that occurred many years ago in ways that sometimes help justify current or future conflicts. You know, it's so incredibly important that we look, I think, at these issues that I'm talking about here, these risks that climate change poses for humanity, so that we can prevent some of these outbreaks from ever occurring in the first place, right? So that we can not only prevent the trauma and the harm for those people directly impacted, but through time as well, right? And again, I don't know if that's what you were getting at, Todd. I apologize, but anyway. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? If you want to put your hand up, I will wait for you to type it in the box. But if there are no more questions, then we have come to the end of today's talk. So students are free to go. So Alex, we ask you to hang on here. We're going to have you meet with members of the board at the end of the session today. So Christine, I will bring you in here. Hey, Christine.
Okay, can you see and hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. So now I need to transfer the attendees on over. Okay, 1 second.
Christine, while you're working, I want to tell you about a graduate student I have.
Oh, please do.
Her folks were refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh.
Oh my gosh.
She was born in Yerevan.
Okay.
She came to LA's Little Armenia as a child, as a very young child. Her first language is Russian. She has since learned Eastern Armenian as an adult while living with family in Yerevan. But really a superstar as a graduate student. So she applied very aggressively to graduate school a few years ago, and she got into I think she got into Chicago, and but not enough money. So she might give it another go.
So is she there for history?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you'll have to get me connected with her. And she just missed a big Armenian party I had. Listen, I think you need to make me host because I can't switch people over.
Okay,
I'm just a panelist, yeah.
Okay, make host.
There we go. So I've got to do a couple steps. I have to allow people to talk, and then I need to promote them to panelists. Sorry. Thanks for your patience. Let's see. Okay, so Nicole, are you there? Nicole?
Yeah, I'm here.
Coming on. Oh, I need to then add Yeho. Hold on a second. Allowed. Are you able all to do video?
It's not giving me the option. Right now I can just do audio.
Okay. Let's see. Promote to panelists. I'll try that one more time. Okay. Yeho, are you good to be on video?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can
Yep.
you promote? Can you do video?
I will. Give
Oh,
me.
good. I
Yep.
just wasn't sure if you had ability to do it.
Yeah, let's see.
Listen, everybody, I have to go. I'm going to make
Bye,
myself
Steve.
a cup
We're
of
all
tea.
good.
So, yeah,
We're good to
thanks,
go.
Alex, and
Thank you.
you'll be hearing from us again next year.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Steve.